half the population died, including 3 members of the Dolinsky family. Back in those days, they did not count women. When they talked about a family, they talked about the head of the family, and that's how they counted the people. So when they say that half the Jewish population died, it could have been just families of three families. In 1861, Florida withdrew from the Union, and Jacksonville had been occupied 3 times by the Confederate troops and 4 times by the Union Army. And one was the U.S. black troop Glory. I don't know whether you all remember that movie that came out, Glory. I think starring Denzel Washington. And that's the army that they were talking about that had settled here in Jacksonville. So the stores that were beginning on Bay Street were Isidore Grunthal, who opened a grocery business with his cousin Hugo. And that name was an early settler here in Jacksonville. Morris Burlak and Robert Williams were married into the Dolinsky family. Now the Burlaks was a large family. They had, he married one of the Dolinsky girls, and they had a large family here. Aaron Zacharias was a tobacco grower, and he and Philip Halley brought their families, and Bay Street began to fill with Jewish merchants. Jacob Bucky, Jacob and Morris Cohen, Leopold Ferschutz, Charles Benedict, and Jacob Huff. And the steamships that began coming into the port to discharge their passengers for lengthy visits. They shopped the bazaars on Bay Street. Jacksonville thrived, and so did the Jewish community. B'nai B'rith was organized as late as 1877. There was the Hebrew Benevolent Society. Jews were members of the city government. The first directory in 1870 listed 20 recognizable Jewish names. By 1880, there were 130 Jews living in Jacksonville with a community of 7,650. This represented 1.7% of the population. Currently, the Jacksonville Jews represent about 1.5% of the community. I think that was the latest figure that I got several years ago. But Morris Dolinsky, who was a brother of Philip, he was just a young boy when he first came to Jacksonville, but as he grew, and he was he fought in the Civil War, and he was fighting for the South. And he returned to Jacksonville after the war, and he was active in politics. In 1881, he was elected mayor. His first action was to order the city's Sunday blue laws strictly enforced. He was later reelected in 1882. He was one of the 4 founding directors of the Jacksonville Board of Trade. He helped organize the volunteer fire department as well as the city's first baseball team. He was one of the founders of the Children's Home Society and was elected municipal judge in 1895, serving in this capacity until his death in 1907. And his body reposed in city council chambers in City Hall, surrounded by an immense number of floral arrangements. And conspicuous was the flag of the Confederacy, of which he was a brave and gallant soldier. This is history. He was Jacksonville's only Jewish mayor. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before, but there was a story about the judge when he heard a case of 2 neighbors, and one neighbor was suing his next door neighbor who was Jewish because they played their violins too loudly all night. He ruled in favor of the Jewish couple. Well, the neighbor who lost yelled out in court that the judge favored the Jewish couple because he himself was Jewish. The judge was quite offended by that and challenged the man to a duel. And it was accepted. Well, of course, this was back in the 1890s. They did things like that. The following day, they appeared in a part of downtown, and as they were pacing off ready to shoot each other, the Jacksonville police intervened, and Judge Dolinsky then arrested the litigants, and they spent a couple of days in jail. I mentioned a little bit about the cemetery and how we got it when we had the yellow fever epidemic, and the city donated this land to us. This cemetery still sits up on the part of Old City Cemetery. It's on Washington and Union Street, I believe, somewhere right up in that area. And we have about 45 people buried there, of which 3 of them are Civil War soldiers. The last burial was in 1935 when Philip Dolinsky's wife, Mary, was buried there. Philip was buried there in 1895. We've got, hold on, I've got something here highlighting these names. Because along with the Dolinskys, which I'd mentioned, was Abraham, the father, but two young boys, one age 12 and one age 19, Henry and Jacob, who died of the yellow fever. And Abraham Zacharias is buried there. So that's a relative of Oberdorfer. The Oberdorfers came down from the Zachariases, along with Ellis Zacharias. With, I'm sure, I don't know how many of you know about him, but he was the one who wrote the letters to the Japanese, read the letters to the Japanese, asking them to give up before they were annihilated by bombs, which they did not until the bomb was hit on them, and then they finally gave up, but he did try. He had been very involved. I'll talk about him a little later when we get into some of the prominent families. Ellen, what have I missed out on now? You've been kind of listening.
Covered most everything. We want to do a little more on businesses, but the first cemetery, the city's first cemetery, we had taken a ride over there, and that everyone here can go and see for themselves what's there. And then you had done some campaigning to clean it up and get headstones back in place.
We did. I mean, it had been so desecrated because it was a neighborhood where kids would go in there and probably do things just to be destructive. And some of the stones were broken. They were on the ground. I had asked the board of directors for money to help us restore it. I got some pricing, and we had all the stones restored, replaced, the whole cemetery fixed up. And in 2009, we had a dedication by the current mayor, who came out and dedicated the renewal of this old cemetery, and a new stone was installed. A lot of people were there. Susan, you were there. You want to contribute something on that? Susan, go ahead.
Susan's mic.
Yeah, give Susan her mic. Susan, you can talk about your impression of that cemetery.
I have to figure out how to
she's got
I'm unmuted. What was it, Hazel, about? Was it 12, 13 years ago that we did a Jewish historical tour of Jacksonville?
Well,
and I think it was that long ago.
It was 2009 that it was restored, and so it was probably, that's 11 years, so it's probably maybe 10 years ago 9 or 10 years ago that we did the tour.
So Hazel and I got a nice Greyhound bus, and some of you went with us, and we had a complete tour of Jacksonville, that was anything that was left. And sometimes we had to say, Hazel would say, well, this used to be, or that used to be, because down in the La Villa area, there wasn't much left, and now there's hardly anything. But I think when we went to the old cemetery, Hazel, you actually took us around and we looked at the stones, and there was a stone that was dedicated to a Black woman who was very important in the area, and it was a big mausoleum. Do you remember that?
Oh, that was not in our cemetery. Yeah, it was in Old City Cemetery. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
They also have a large section of Civil War soldiers, Confederate soldiers buried there.
And we also, in Hazel, we also took the gal who's a descendant of Dolinsky. I can't think of her name.
Margaret Miller. Margaret Miller.
The other one.
Wilma Langle.
Wilma.
Yeah,
Wilma Delingle. Yeah, and she's an actual direct descendant.
Yes.
And she went with us. We had people on there. I think Ruthie may have been with us at that time. Did you go on the tour, Ruthie? No. But Rhoda did, I think, and Goldie was there. I'm not sure who else went, but Hazel took us around, and we got to see the names of these historic families, and then she told us, of course, the stories about them. And then the rest of the tour was just amazing. We went to the downtown area and parked in front of Cohen's, and she told us the stories about the people who own those stores. And I guess you're going to talk to us about that next time. But if you get a chance, you want to go to that cemetery, it's really interesting. And she made sure that the Jewish part was cleaned up and new stones, and it looks really good.
Thank you so much, Ellen. You've been up there, you saw it. One of the things, Susan, when we took that tour, was we went up to where the old Jewish Center was, and of course it has since that trip, it has since burned. It's another one of those things that this used to be and this was here, but the only thing left in old Jacksonville downtown that goes back to the early days was the YMHA building. And it's still out there on East Adams Street or West Adams Street, and it sits there. But it's another. It belongs to something else now. But it's a very familiar building with all the steps on it, because so many pictures were taken of classrooms and organizations of everybody lined up on the steps. They could get everybody there and see everybody at one time. It was a great place for photographs. There's not much of downtown, old Jewish downtown anymore. I mean, our own history is downtown.
Right. One thing that you mentioned as we go back in time, how people were counted, how women were not counted. And
well, they were counted. They were counted by families.
Right.
So, I mean, it was the head of household, and that's how a family was counted, by the head of household. And I think that goes along with the times. It wasn't necessarily because they were Jewish. It was just for the times. So when they say that half the population got sick and died of the yellow fever epidemic, that could be, three families, three or four families were referenced in that. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how they did it, but it wasn't until about 1870 that they started doing census, and then they tracked the number of families, and in that they would list who was in the family. So prior to that, we didn't have much information on that.
And that in 1882 we had 20.
1882, we had what? You were going to say something? Yeah. Ellen?
Yes. Can you hear me?
From Rhoda, yeah. Remind us about what our current location comes from previous buildings, the doors, the stained glass. Oh, Rhoda, that's a good point. Very good point, Rhoda. I mean, our first location, we're going to talk about that.
Down there, that's coming up.
It's coming up, yeah. But so it's coming up, I think, in our next program.
The early families are next.
Yeah.
But I mean, you could just do a quick overview of the different temples and the.
We were down at Laura and Union, and in that big fire of 1901, the building was burned along with everything else. It was 140 blocks of city. The city, I don't know how many blocks there were, but it was all of downtown was burned. And ours, actually, we had, the temple was the first building that was rebuilt, and it was rebuilt in the same style and same shape of the previous one that had burned. So pictures that we have of what we call our first temple actually was taken later on, because when we left there in 1910 to move into a bigger building, it was taken over by different other religious organizations over the years. But we were on Laura and Ashley, and when we outgrew that, we went to Riverside, and then from there we moved in 1950, and then in 1979 we moved to the South Side. So this is the history of that. We'll go into a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, one of the interesting details about the cost, I see David's here. It cost $7,000 to build in 1882. Just so if you get a sense of the price of things these days.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was $25,000, was it?
My note says 7,000, 24 members.
7,000, that was it. We had
24 members.
24 members, that was it. That was the number. You got better notes than I have. But it was started out as an Orthodox shul but we had an organ, and we had six little girls that had raised money with their little sales to. And where did I have that? I have that in there somewhere. Beginning of it, where they raised their money. Here it is. There's six little Jewish girls, and among them was Dee Dee Slager, Pauline Zacharias, Claire Walter, and May Landauer. These girls had formed a club, and by giving a benefit bazaar, managed to raise about $75. This sum was contributed to the building fund. The girls were given the honor of participating in the dedication of the synagogue they'd helped to build. Now they were because it was an Orthodox shul, they still were part of the dedication services. And it was in 1886. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later with that. Ellen, go ahead. What next?
Well, what I want to do is invite people to ask questions as we look at this part of the history of Jews in Jacksonville. If there's anyone with questions, I know Rhoda sent a chat message in. You can do that, or you can raise the hand and I can just unmute you. Does anyone have any comments? Is anyone from the original families? Oh, Susan Board is raising a hand.
I wanted to ask Hazel if she could talk a little bit about the La Villa area downtown and the Push-a-Lot Jews who settled there, who all came from the same area, I think in Russia. And do you remember all that?
Yeah, a little bit about that. They came in the mid 1890s, and they came from a little town called Push-a-Lot, and they were called the Push-a-Lotters. And they did settle in La Villa, and some of the families, one of the most prominent families that came in that group were the Finkelsteins. And now the Finkelsteins, they started with he was a peddler, and the Mrs. Finkelstein, I can't remember their names off the top of my head right now, but she ran the house and took in whatever new people came to town, and because they were Orthodox, she was able to take care of them and feed them. And it was known as the Finkelstein boarding house. And this building stayed, I think, it was still on the street on West Adams Street until somewhere around the mid 1980s. I remember seeing it down there, but that family had 9 children, and a lot of the families that came down from that, you've got Leonard Fink and Linda Wilkinson came down from that family. Oh gosh, off the top of my head, I'm sitting here trying to remember. I hate to stretch my memory to too much, but the Pankins came down from that. there's one, the family was kind of divided. Some of them came down and were part of the Reform congregation. And then about half of them were part of the Jewish Center. And the Genziers, who were very prominent in River Garden, Sheldon and his father, and Sheldon is still living. I think he's at River Garden right now, but he came down from that family, and his mother was a daughter of the Finkelsteins that came down. But other people that came in around in that time, and we can talk a little bit more about that when we get into other families, but the Wolfsons were part of that too. They lived in La Villa, and he was a trash picker and did what he could. And I'll have a lot more details on the Wolfsons later when we get into the families. But the Pushalotters eventually, they found that the congregation, the temple was too reform for them. And so by 1901, they chartered their own congregation called B'nai Israel. And they built their own building, and it was dedicated in 1909. And it was right there on Jefferson Street in La Villa, which later in 1927, became the Jewish Center. And then it became more conservative as opposed to being Orthodox. And then the Orthodox separated and eventually built their first shul on a university at time around the mid-1940s. So that's how that one split out. So it all started with the temple, but eventually as the congregations grew, more people came, and some of them wanted to retain the old ways. Some of them wanted to kind of hit a halfway point. It was after, I think, World War I, if I'm not mistaken, that the conservative movement began here in Jacksonville, and people wanted to have a little bit more of freedom in the way they lived and joining the communities, but still keep a lot of the old traditions. So that's kind of how the conservative movement started. I got some of that from written up by the Sapers. Any more questions?
We have Mary Edwards. Let me make sure. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Hazel, for sharing all your knowledge with us. Two quick questions. One, Ellen, are you recording this? Are we keeping a copy of this?
I did hit something. I think so.
Okay, it might be nice to have.
Sure.
Because, I mean, we're not all going to remember all this ourselves potentially, so it'd be great. I know I see that there's the option to record at the bottom of the screen. Of course, I didn't touch it, but I just wanted to bring that up. The second thing is, Hazel, when you talked about the Finkelsteins, didn't he have a 5 and 10 in Edgewood? A 5 and 10 store?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
because I can remember as a kid riding my bike to Finkelsteins and buying stuff.
Probably. That one I don't remember.
Okay.
I don't, because you get some other families that had stores too. Oh gee, don't ask me names. You're catching me here.
That's all right. No, I just went, since you brought up the Finkelsteins, I wanted to confirm that.
Well, he had a little leather shop downtown called the Finkelsteins, and then eventually it became the leather shop, and it ended up up at Hemming Plaza.
Yeah, the luggage shop was the luggage shop, right? I remember going in there as a child as well.
Yeah.
So and the Buchholz family were connected to that, weren't they, in some way?
Buchholz, yes, they were.
Yeah, right.
In there.
Right.
And, then of course that was torn down to make way for the new library. So.
Gotcha. I'll mute myself. I'm not trying to monopolize the time. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. You got any other questions? Anybody else got any other questions?
Has everyone had a chance to look in the archives of the display case? There's a 7-generation family, 5-generation family.
I mean, you know, Susan, we were talking about Wilma Lengel. Margaret Miller is also a descendant. I mean, Wilma and Margaret are 4th-generation descendants of Philip Dolinsky. So that comes down as actually like the 5th generation they came down from George, 4th generation from George, so the fifth generation from Philip. And they have children here. There's still descendants living here in Jacksonville because there's Margaret.
Claire Hogshead is.
Claire.
Yeah, Claire is a
Wilma's,
descendant.
Yeah.
Okay, I see Toby and Ringle and Sophia Pentel have questions. So let me unmute. Toby, we're gonna unmute. Or what is this? Chat, make, rename, remember. All right, I love my buttons. So Toby, can you unmute
There,
and
yeah,
ask the question?
yeah.
There you go. Thank you, Toby.
Yeah, I was just going to make the comment. The Finkelsteins had a big discount store on Bay Street. Is that not the same
Finkelsteins?
family?
Oh, I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was.
A big complex for many years.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were probably. I mean, Bay Street was the street for everything.
Yeah. And didn't the Langles also have a brother? Isn't there a brother? Wilma and Margaret and Claire, and was there not a brother?
Margaret has a brother that lives out in California. Yeah. Margaret and Wilma and a brother, and Margaret has a son and a daughter, and she's got 2 grandchildren. So I mean, there's a lot of descendants of the Dolinskys right here.
Well, of course, there's Claudia too.
They had a big celebration.
David Stein, yeah.
Yeah, about 4 years ago, down they were part of a Purim party presentation that the Jewish Museum in Miami held, and they honored early families, and the Dolinsky was one, and there were some other families.
Where is Sophia? Sophia, you have a question? You want to unmute? Is Sophia, there she is. Sophia, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Can I offer a comment?
Of course.
Good. That was my
I
question.
don't see Sophia. Where is she?
Well,
I'm here. This is Laura.
Laura's going to ask a question and then we'll get to Sophia.
Laura wants to say that I have come up with questions that I thought no one in the world would be ever able to answer. And Hazel has a record of it.
If I can find it in print, I'll read it.
She finds it. I don't know how, but take my word, if ever you come up with a question that, gee, it's possible, but I don't see how we're going to ever know this. Don't ever discount it. While I was working at Temple, people would call in and ask if we had possibly a record of this person or that person, or when they were bar mitzvahed, or when they were married or buried, or where. And the records are there. The records are there. If there was any record, any written word about it, Miss Hazel Mack knows how to find it.
Well, you worked with me in the archives too, so you know what goes on in there.
I do, and it still amazes me. I came up with the picture the other day, folks. I was checking out a cleaning project that I had employed someone for out at the cemetery, and we came across a stone that was so covered with, you know, the moss and uncared for and been there forever. And I just took a picture of it and said, you know, this is in the old center cemetery section, but I'm going to ask Hazel, and believe it or not, although we have no idea who these people are, she had a picture of that stone and could read what it said.
Thank you, Laura. Sophia, I know you had a question.
Yes, it's nothing to do with this. I was looking while Hazel was talking, which, you know, with her information and so on, it's really amazing to know all the dates. But I started to look on the computer, and I thought that that's something valid that we should know, that the first settlers were in 16th century, the Huguenots who went, you know, who left Europe because of the, they were going through with the Catholics, they were going through being ostracized and so on. Well, anyway, I wonder if Hazel knows or she found some remnants of those first settlers who are the Huguenots.
No, I don't. I wish I did, but I'm familiar with what you're talking about because they, I think the Jacksonville Historical Society may have more information on that. My own family, my family is French, and they came from France, and the history that I have of my family talked about how they used to fight with the Huguenots.
Yeah.
And they'd have these wars with the Huguenots, and the Huguenots left France, much like the Jews left Europe to come to where they had freedom. And the Huguenots did come to Jacksonville and around Fort Caroline, and also between that and St. Augustine. But I don't have any record of who they were, but I believe that the Jacksonville Historical Society does have a lot of that information, because I attended a meeting there one time where they had somebody who had come over from France who was part of the Huguenot Society. And he came and he talked about their trip here. So they have a lot of that information if you want to follow up on that. I don't.
Okay, thank you. I just kind of wondered.
I have two things. I know Karen Beckelman made a comment, and then after that, if Leslie Wolfson has a question. Oh, Karen's quiet. Karen, did you want to say you?
I don't remember what I wrote. Let me look.
You moved here 51 years ago?
Oh, yeah, you're talking about business.
And downtown.
I'm from New York, and when I married Frank, we moved to Orlando pre-Disney. It was culture shock, and I was not really happy with the location. And when Frank had an opportunity to come to Jacksonville, we took it, and there was a real downtown there. It was so exciting to have Maycones and all those kind of Ivies and what have you, that we could shop in real stores.
Pershkets. Yeah,
Pershkets, love Pershkets. Yeah.
I know, up around Hemming Plaza, it was great. I enjoyed it too.
Right, Purcells and Roses, and
There
it was
was
just
Pershkets and Rose and Blue.
And they were all in the malls.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they would do. They were up there.
Regency had just opened when we moved here. My husband was in sales, and Maycones was his biggest customer here.
Oh.
And yeah, I used to work there at Christmas time.
Karen, I didn't realize that you'd been in Jacksonville that long.
51 years.
Long time.
Wow. Yeah.
I know Leslie had a question for you, Hazel.
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear me?
Go
Yes.
ahead, Leslie. Yeah.
I have a question. I have something to tell you.
Okay.
Frank Leangle is a friend of mine. He graduated high school with me at Landon. That's Wilma's and Margaret's brother. And he lives in California, and he's my age, which is young. And when they, three of them come
I'm having trouble understanding you. You said you had
Jacksonville Historical Society. Here you are.
I'm sorry, we just had to mute Sophie, who was on the phone. Go ahead.
Oh,
Leslie.
Yeah, Leslie. Okay.
Okay, I'll say Wilma and Margaret have a brother, as you wondered. His name is Frank.
Yes.
He's my age. He lives in California.
Yes.
And when we have reunions, he always comes in, for the Landon reunions. And I had no idea he has this background. So we should talk to the three of them and see if we can make some kind of a project out of their history. That was just my suggestion.
It's a good one.
That's a good one.
I know
Yeah.
Bernie put up his blue hand, Mr. Nachman.
Bernie? What you got, Bernie? Give him some sound.
He has sound.
I'm having trouble with the internet connection, but you were commenting about how the Jewish population in Jacksonville moved around over the years from Springfield to La Villa, and then ultimately to Riverside, where the temple was built after they moved downtown. And I always used to kid that right after World War II, the rivers, St. John's River waters parted, and the children of Israel at that time, between 1945 and 50, the children of Israel crossed over and moved to Southside. It was like Moses again.
Well, I know with you, Toby has a question.
Well, because Bernie just made a joke, I got that. He said how we crossed the river. We went from Springfield and crossed over to Riverside, then crossed the river to Southside. But yeah. I wanted to also mention Claudia Langle Stein. She's another sister. Wilma's the oldest, then Claudia. I don't know where Frank and Margaret come. One's older than the other, but I'm not sure. But Wilma's the oldest, then Claudia, then the other two.
Yeah, Frank is
Claudia Stein.
Yeah. Frank is my age.
And Claudia's my age. Wilma's a little older. I don't know where. Margaret's younger. Margaret, I thought, was your age too. No,
she's older.
She's about that. She's older. Okay, she's older than Frank. Okay, well, that's the family.
Frank's
I just didn't want you to leave Claudia out. I just wanted to add Claudia. That's all.
We have a few more minutes if anyone else has questions.
I see Goldie on there. I haven't heard from Goldie.
Goldie, where? I see Goldie. Goldie, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I have very fond memories of the day that we so proudly rededicated that cemetery downtown. That was a long, hard fight to get the money together, and it was really a yeoman's job that Hazel did. She really was the lone soldier in fighting for that, and I think a lot of us really learned kind of in the trenches. We learned how to honor our ancestors when we rededicated that cemetery. I would just put in a plug for some more effort to be made for the Evergreen portion or the temple portion at Evergreen Cemetery that also could use a little loving care. But that's one of my first memories of working with Hazel, and it is an indelible one. Thank you very much, Hazel.
Thank you, Goldie. Thank you. I don't know if you had any questions of anything else.
No. Well, I hope everyone has a chance to get to that cemetery. It's quite fascinating. And of course, come into the archives. It was, how many boxes did you unbox? Was it roomfuls of boxes when you started to put the archives together?
Oh, God, it's hard to tell because first of all, I had to pack up what we had in the old kitchen. But it just seemed that every time we came in, we'd find another box. Somebody, people would have things at home maybe. But things that I was missing, I remember I had all of my temple messengers and I was missing one book with about 3 years worth of messengers, and I don't know what happened to that. But all of a sudden one day I open a box and there's a bunch of copies of those minutes from those messengers. So I had them bound and we got them back in there. So we got that completed. We do have our temple messengers as early as 1922. They used to put out very little tiny little booklet type of things. and it put little social notes in it. And then they began to grow, and they grow a little bit longer. And then everything got put on mimeograph there for a while before they had computers and printers. But we do have them going all the way back. There's a few years that we're missing. During the war years, things weren't always completed. During World War II, we've got temple messengers that go back to 1935. And they're available for anybody who wants to come and look at them. There's a lot of history in there. We had somebody come in one time and want to do some research on Rabbi Kaplan. So I pulled out all the files we had on Rabbi Kaplan, and he went through all of that. And believe me, Rabbi Kaplan's notes were unbelievable, because he kept things on backs of envelopes, on little napkins, and those are his sermon notes. And that's how he gave his sermons. But he started looking at the yearbooks, and he said he got more information in the yearbooks when Rabbi Kaplan would talk about his articles in the yearbooks. He was more open about what was going on in the world than he was in some of his notes that we had in his files. So, see, the yearbooks were very valuable documents, and they will continue to be valuable documents. And I'm glad we're going to have a yearbook again this year.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
I had asked Hazel, what was the craziest thing you got as an archive artifact? And she told me about a very large artifact. I thought it would be cute to go out on this, just as a fun story.
I came across a file one time, and there it was. We used to own an airplane, and one of our members, whose name escapes me right now, had this airplane, and he donated it to the temple in lieu of his paying his dues. He gave that so that the temple could sell it, and the money they got would go towards payment of his dues. So it was left with the temple to sell. But it was a little Cessna aircraft, a single engine plane. And I've got all the information on the files on it. But the funny thing was when Rabbi Leaf first came, apparently, like everything else with airplanes, all the records, the serial numbers are kept, and people do research through whatever reasons they want. And he found out that we had one, and he called the temple and spoke with the rabbi, and the rabbi didn't know anything about it. And Goldie, you were on there, and you didn't know anything about it either, and you came to me and said, "Oh yeah, I can tell you about that." It was another thing again that showed up, just an odd item. So I've got the records of the sale of that Cessna. I think we got $3,000 for it, but there was a lot of paperwork involved to sell that thing. And over the years, the temple stopped accepting gifts of that sort, because it meant that they were responsible for selling it. They would always recommend that something in the last few years that anybody from the board here that's on here would remember that it would be up to the individual to sell it and donate the money to the temple. So
if you have an old plane or boat, sell it before you give it to us.
Can I put in one last plug for the archives?
Please.
So I would just remind everybody that everything that we do today is archival material for the generations to come.
Yes.
So please remember, Hazel used to yell at me all the time about this. Please remember to put a date, including the year, on every single piece of anything that you create. And please remember that really every flyer, every set of minutes, every picture, all of this is ultimately archives. And I imagine that you share my thoughts of how precious this history is. And remember that we're making more of that history every day. So treasure it and make sure Hazel gets a copy of everything.
I always say, when it comes to particularly the vital statistics, births, marriages, deaths, et cetera, 50 years from now, somebody may want to know something about what's going on now, but 50 years from now, we got to have these records, because I get calls for people that want information that's 50 years old, 70 years old. Like Laura said, when she's been on the switchboard, answering the phone at the temple. I get phone calls from people all over the country wanting information, and it's amazing what we can find out. So just remember to keep it up. We have to keep it up. We're a little behind in putting some of this information in, but we're working on it.
Hazel,
Yes.
this is Rhoda. When Susan Board and I were co-presidents was when around the time that our sisterhood was having a centennial. And we had so much fun going with you into the archives
Yes.
and finding all kinds of old cookbooks and tablecloths and cool things. We had a wonderful display, and so much of it was with your help. And again, if people hadn't saved those things for you, we wouldn't have had them. So supplementing what Goldie said, you know, I kind of worry about so much being email now and this and that.
That's true.
Really,
That's true.
our records will be disappearing in the future.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, if you don't print it and give it to me, it's got to be done. So thank you very much. Look forward to the next 2 weeks from now. We'll talk about our temple and a little bit more about that.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Hazel.
That's all, so we can.
You're welcome. Beverly and Mel Fruit. Mel, I didn't hear from you at all today. Usually you're one of my staunch supporters.
Mel just has to unmute if he wants to say anything.
No, he doesn't have to.
No? Okay.
We just want to all thank you.
Thank you all. See you in 2 weeks. Be back in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Hazel.
Okay. Thank you.
Good night.